Brute punches an 80-year-old woman on the street. 4 bikers make him pay instantly. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Clayton's quiet streets. It was a peaceful evening, one that made people feel safe. Margaret Thompson, 80 years old and known for her warm smile, was on her usual stroll to the bakery. She cherished these short walks, enjoying the crisp autumn air and the chance to stretch her legs. Margaret had lived in Clayton her entire life. She was well loved in the neighborhood, always the first to welcome new families with baked goods and kind words. As she walked, thinking about treats for her grandchildren's visit that weekend, she didn't notice the dark figure approaching from behind. The man was Vincent "Vince" Callahan, a troublemaker with a notorious reputation for aggression and unpredictability. That night he was in a foul mood, and Margaret just happened to cross his path. Without warning, Vince raised his fist and struck her with brutal force. She crumpled to the ground, letting out a pained cry as she hit the pavement. Vince, unbothered, smirked and kept walking as if his assault was nothing out of the ordinary. But Vince had made a critical mistake. Not far from where Margaret fell, 4 bikers stood outside a diner, their motorcycles lined up neatly along the curb. They weren't just any bikers. They were members of the Iron Wolves, a close-knit club with a reputation for loyalty and justice. Leading them was Diego Rivera, a bear of a man with a thick beard and sharp, watchful eyes. Beside him stood his brothers, Colt, a former Marine covered in tattoos, Andre, a towering figure with a booming laugh and a quick temper, and Jackson, the quietest but fastest of the group. The laughter between them stopped when Diego saw Vince hit Margaret. Fury surged through him, and he exchanged a look with Colt, who was already stepping off his bike. Without a word, the bikers sprang into action. Jackson reached Margaret first, kneeling beside her with gentle urgency. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice calm despite the adrenaline in his veins. Margaret groaned, clutching her side from the hard fall, a trickle of blood at the corner of her mouth where Vince's punch had landed. "That guy hit me," Margaret whispered, her voice shaky but steady. "For no reason." Jackson's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone gentle. "Don't worry, ma'am, we've got you." He took out his phone and called for an ambulance. "Help's on the way," he assured her before rising to join the others. Meanwhile, Diego, Colt, and Andre had locked eyes on Vince, who was swaggering off, clueless about the storm about to catch up with him. The bikers weren't about to let him slip into the night. They broke into a sprint, their boots pounding against the asphalt as they closed the distance. Vince noticed them too late. He turned just in time to see Diego charging toward him like a freight train. "What the—" Vince began, but Diego slammed into him, tackling him to the ground and sending them both skidding across the pavement. "You like picking on old ladies, huh?" Diego snarled, pinning Vince's arms effortlessly. Vince struggled wildly, throwing punches and kicking, but Colt was there in an instant, grabbing Vince's flailing limbs. "Oh, you've got some fight in you?" Colt said with a grin, his Marine instincts kicking in. "Not for long, buddy." Vince managed a wild punch that grazed Andre's cheek. The biker staggered but didn't go down. Instead, he wiped a thin trickle of blood from his lip and smirked, a slow, dangerous smile. "Oh, now you're really in trouble." With practiced teamwork, they pinned Vince down, securing his arms and legs so he couldn't move. He cursed and thrashed, but the bikers were unfazed. They'd faced worse than Vince Callahan before. Diego leaned close to Vince. "You picked the wrong day, the wrong street, and the wrong woman, coward." When the police arrived, Vince lay subdued, breathing heavily and swearing under his breath. The officers approached cautiously. 4 large bikers standing over a man on the ground was always a scene that drew questions. But then Margaret's voice called out from behind Jackson. "It was him. That man hit me. These boys stopped him." The officers didn't hesitate. They cuffed Vince as his protests were drowned out by the murmurs of the crowd that had gathered. Word had spread fast, and neighbors lined the sidewalk, their faces a mix of shock and admiration for the bikers who had stood up for one of their own. As Vince was loaded into the back of a squad car, an officer lingered to take statements from Diego and the others. "You guys really saved the day," he said, scribbling notes. "He's got a record a mile long. Been arrested for assault more times than I can count. Figures, Colt muttered. Thought he could get away with hitting someone who couldn't fight back. Not today, Diego replied, folding his arms. Not on our watch. Moments later, the ambulance arrived. Paramedics checked on Margaret, who insisted she was fine, though they gently urged her to go to the hospital for observation. As they carefully lifted her onto the gurney, she looked at the bikers, a grateful smile spreading across her face. Thank you, boys, Margaret whispered. You're my angels today. Diego's tough exterior softened a bit as he nodded respectfully. You take care, ma'am, he said. As the ambulance pulled away, the bikers watched quietly, standing together as the last police car drove off. The night had settled in, streetlights casting a warm glow over the quiet street. Well, Andre said, breaking the silence, that was one hell of a detour. Diego chuckled, shaking his head. How about that dinner now? Colt grinned. Yeah, I could eat. As they headed back to their motorcycles, a neighbor, Mr. Hartley, a gray-haired older man, approached them. You boys did something good tonight, he said, voice full of gratitude. Margaret's been a part of this neighborhood for as long as I can remember. What you did means a lot to all of us. Diego nodded. She didn't deserve that. No one does. Mr. Hartley smiled. We need more people like you around here. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, engines roaring as they rode off into the night. That evening, the people of Clayton knew their neighborhood had been protected, not by uniforms, but by 4 men who stepped in when it mattered most. That night, the story of what happened spread through town like wildfire. People shared the tale of the bikers who came to Margaret's aid, and soon it became more than just a neighborhood legend. It served as a reminder that heroes come in many forms, not always in badges or capes, but sometimes as everyday people who step up when no one else will. That night, the Iron Wolves proved that standing up for what's right is always worth it, no matter the odds. This story illustrates the power of courage and the impact of stepping in for others in moments of need. It shows that bravery isn't limited to those with authority. Anyone can be a hero if they choose to act when someone is in danger. The bikers didn't know Margaret, but they recognized an injustice, and their swift response reminds us that communities are stronger when people take responsibility for each other, despite the risks. The contrast between Vince Callahan's cruelty and the bikers' selflessness highlights an essential lesson. Violence and intimidation thrive when good people stay silent. The Iron Wolves could have walked away, telling themselves it wasn't their problem. Instead, they took action, showing that standing up to bullies, no matter how threatening, can prevent further harm. Their bravery reminds us that our actions, whether big or small, can create a ripple effect that restores safety and trust in our communities. The story also raises questions about accountability. Vince's violent history shows how unchecked aggression can put vulnerable people at risk. It challenges us to consider how society should respond to repeated offenders to prevent future harm. But above all, the bikers' actions remind us that anyone can make a difference. In moments of crisis or in our daily lives, there is always an opportunity to protect those who cannot protect themselves. So what would you do in a situation like this? Would you step in if you saw someone being harmed, even if it meant putting yourself at risk?